The morning I found the Whetstone, I stood at my toolbox for a long time without moving. Grip was at my boots, his grey muzzle pointed at the tree line, and neither of us made a sound. There was frost on the toolbox lid around it, the way frost forms on metal overnight. And in that frost the stone sat like something placed with deliberate care, roughly 9 inches long, palm wide, dressed smooth on one face. I reached out and touched it before I thought to stop myself. It was cold the way stone is cold, not the way iron is cold, and it had a weight to it when I picked it up that I felt all the way up my forearm. My eyes went to the tree line without deciding to. I've been looking for the right word for what I felt in that moment for the better part of 2 years now. I haven't found one yet. To understand why that stone unmade me the way it did, I need to go back to the week before I drove out there and maybe a year before that and maybe 2. Loretta died in March, 2 years before I took the Calder job. She was 56 years old. It was fast, the way those things sometimes are, and I was grateful for that later, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. 6 weeks between the diagnosis and the morning she wasn't there anymore. And in those 6 weeks, the world kept asking things of me that I tried to answer correctly. I signed papers. I spoke to her sister on the phone. I stood in a funeral parlour in my good boots and shook hands with people whose faces I knew, but whose names had left me entirely. I did what needed doing. That's what I knew how to do. What I did not do was sharpen my tools. That sounds small, I understand that it sounds small. But I had been a carpenter for 31 years by then, finish work and log cabin construction mostly, and the habit of sharp tools was so basic to how I worked that it had stopped being a thought and become just a part of morning. You drink your coffee, you check the sky, you sharpen your blades. That was the order of things. Except that Loretta, for the last 12 or 13 years of our marriage, had gotten into the habit of doing it for me. She would wake before I did most mornings, and by the time I came out to the shop, she would have already run my chisels and my plane blades across the Whetstone, wiped them clean on an old flannel rag, and set the stone on the toolbox lid where I'd see it. She never said anything about it. I never thanked her for it the way I should have. It was just there, every morning, just there. After she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I tried a few times in the first weeks. I'd pick up a chisel, hold it at the right angle over the stone, and then just set it back down. I told myself I was busy. I told myself the blades were still good enough. A man can work a long time with an edge that's a little off if he adjusts his technique, and I adjusted mine. And for 2 years, I worked with tools that were not what they should have been. And I told myself that was fine. The Calder job came in September through a builder I'd worked with before named Pete Harmon. Pete ran a small outfit out of a town about 40 miles south of where I lived. And he'd found a client who wanted a log cabin finished interior on 40 remote acres up in the hill country. The kind of land you get to by driving 4 miles of gravel road that quits being a road about a mile before you arrive. The cabin was already framed and roofed. It needed floors, trim, window casings, a kitchen surround, and interior wall paneling in the main room. 4 weeks of work for one careful man, Pete said. He knew I worked alone. I said yes before he finished describing the job. I needed to be somewhere I didn't know. I needed to be somewhere that didn't have the particular shape of 2 years of quiet in it. I packed my tools and my gear and I loaded Grip into the truck and I drove out there on a Thursday in early October. The kind of October morning where the light is clear and cold and the hardwoods have just started turning. Grip had his big grey head out the window for the first mile of gravel road, and then the road got rough enough that he pulled it in and put it on my knee instead, and I drove the last 3 miles with his ear under my hand. The cabin sat in a clearing at the end of the road. It was a good building, solid chinked logs, a covered porch facing east, and behind it, the woods came in close. Hemlock and white oak mostly, with some birch on the higher ground to the north. There was a hand-dug well with a working pump, a small generator shed, and a woodshed that whoever had started this job had already half-filled with split oak. I appreciated that. It meant someone had been out here recently. I noted it and moved on. I set up my work inside, laid out my tools on the tailgate, and then organized them into the big steel toolbox I'd had for 20 years, the one with the combination lock that no longer worked, and the dent in the left side from when I'd dropped it off a scaffold in 2009. I made a list of what the job needed and in what order, the way I always did, and I put the list in my chest pocket where I'd see it. I started a fire in the wood stove Pete had already installed in the main room, because the mornings were cold enough now that working without one would have been stupid and slow. Grip settled on the old camp blanket I brought for him and put his chin on his front paws and watched me work with the patient calm that old dogs develop after years of watching their people do the same things over and over. The first morning I went to sharpen my chisels, I stood at the toolbox with the stone in my hand for a minute before I put it back. My hands knew what to do. My hands had always known. The problem wasn't technique. I set the stone on the lid and left it there and picked up a chisel that was dull enough to feel it in the cut, and I started working, and I told myself I'd sharpen them later. I know what that sounds like. I knew what it sounded like then too. A man avoiding a small ritual is not usually avoiding just the ritual. The first 2 days went the way first days on a remote job always go. You learn the building's particular mistakes, the places where someone cut a corner on the framing or where a log sits slightly out of level, and everything downstream of it has to compensate. The floor-subfloor had a soft spot in the northeast corner I marked and worked around. The window rough openings on the west wall were a 1/4 inch high on the left side, all 3 of them, which told me that whoever had built the forms for that wall had a slight lean in how he held a level. I adjusted my casings and moved on. The work was honest work, and I was glad to have it. Grip went outside on his own at dawn and came back at dark. He was 12 years old and he didn't range far, but he wasn't a dog who needed watching. He'd learned long ago that I wasn't going anywhere without him. And he'd learned whatever the old dog equivalent of patience was, that deep, settled quality that makes a grey-muzzled hound the best company a man alone can have. I talked to him some while I worked. Not much. Enough. The 3rd morning, I noticed the sawdust. I'd swept the main room floor clean the night before, the way I always did before leaving for the day, the way I always did on any job where I was sleeping on site. Clean floor at the end of the day tells you where you were, and a clean floor in the morning tells you if anything changed overnight. I'd left a sawdust pile near the south wall where I'd been fitting trim pieces, swept into a tidy heap against the baseboard. In the morning that heap was distributed. Not scattered like wind, not knocked sideways like a dog would do. Spread gradually over about 3 feet of floor, the way sawdust spreads when something moves through it, carefully, something large and close to the ground. I stood and looked at it for a minute. Grip sniffed the area thoroughly, and then came and sat on my boot and looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as unconcerned. I told myself the generator had vibrated the floor overnight. The generator was in the shed 20 feet away, and it hadn't been running. And even when it ran, the floors in that building didn't vibrate enough to distribute sawdust 3 feet. I told myself that anyway, and went to work. The 4th morning, the coffee tin was moved. I drank instant coffee on that job, made with water heated on the wood stove. I kept the tin on the right side of the windowsill in the kitchen area, where I'd set it the first morning because that was the natural place to set it. It was a blue tin, one of those cheaply made grocery store tins. Nothing special, but I'd had it out there and that was where I kept it. On the fourth morning, I woke up, and it was on the left side of the windowsill, flush against the window frame, turned so the label faced the wall. I stood in the kitchen in my socks and the morning cold and looked at it for longer than made sense. I had not moved it. I did not move things in my sleep, and I did not walk in my sleep, and I was, despite everything else that was wrong with my life, a man who knew where he put things. I told myself I'd been distracted the night before. That was the second failed explanation. I knew it was thin when I said it, and the part of my mind that registered the thinness filed it away alongside the sawdust and kept working. A person can maintain a reasonable theory about the world a fair while past the point where the evidence stops supporting it, if maintaining the theory is more comfortable than the alternative. That evening, the fourth evening, Grip raised his head. We were on the porch after I'd quit for the day. The light was going golden thin over the western ridgeline, and the temperature had dropped the way it drops in hill country when a cold night is coming. That specific falling away of warmth that feels more like something leaving than something failing. I had a coffee cup in my hands, and Grip was at my feet with his chin on the porch boards, and we were both watching the tree line the way you do when there's nothing particular to watch. When Grip lifted his head and turned his ears toward the hemlock stand at the north end of the clearing, he held that for a full minute. I timed it because something about the quality of his attention made me want to track it. His ears were oriented toward the same spot. No wavering, no scanning. His body was completely still. He was not alarmed. I know the difference in that dog between alert and alarmed, and this was alert. The kind of steadiness he showed when he heard a deer at distance, except there was nothing in his body that suggested any inclination to give chase. He was paying attention the way he paid attention to someone he recognized, which I noted and then told myself I was reading too much into. After a full minute, he put his chin back on the boards and his ears relaxed, and he closed his eyes. I watched the hemlock stand for another few minutes. The light was almost gone. Nothing moved in the trees that I could see, but the trees were dark and close, and I was not a young man with young eyes, and I was aware of both of those things. I went inside. I made sure Grip came with me. I'm not a person who believes in things I can't explain. I want to be clear about that. I have spent most of my adult life in the physical world, measuring things and cutting them and joining them, and my judgment of what is credible is built on 31 years of that kind of attention. When I say what happened next, I am saying it the way I would report anything I observed on a job, as accurately as I can, without decoration, and with the understanding that what I observed is what I observed regardless of whether it makes sense. If you've never stood at a toolbox at first light and felt the world tilt 3 degrees off its axis, I'm not sure I can fully explain what that's like. But maybe stay with me a little longer. The 5th morning I woke early before full light and took the wood stove from cold to warm and put water on for coffee and pulled on my work jacket. Grip followed me out to the truck where I kept my toolbox locked in the bed under a tarp. I pulled the tarp back and undid the tailgate, and I looked at the toolbox lid. The Whetstone was centered on it, roughly 9 inches long, palm wide, dressed smooth on one face. It had been placed with the smooth face up. There was frost on the metal of the toolbox lid around it, but not on the stone itself, as if it had been set there after the frost had already formed. I stood there for a long time. I picked up the stone. I turned it over. It was river-dressed on the rough face, the kind of surface you get from a stone that has spent years in moving water, irregular and slightly pitted. And the dressed face had been worked by something, rubbed smooth in the way a stone is smoothed by long use or by patient labor. It was the right shape for a whetstone. It was the right weight. It was not a stone that had fallen from anywhere, Not one that the wind had moved, not one that had any business being on the lid of a locked steel toolbox. I checked the ground around the truck. The frost was hard on the clay soil around the clearing. There were no prints in it that I could see. Not in the frost, not in the thin mud at the edge of the clearing where the frost hadn't formed. I walked the full perimeter of the truck, looking, the way I would check for damage after a storm. Nothing. Grip walked with me, nose down, and at the north end he stopped and lifted his head toward the hemlock stand, the same spot as the night before. He stood there for a moment and then came back to my side and looked up at me. I went inside and sat down on the camp stool I used as a kitchen chair and held the stone in both hands and did not move for a while. The rational explanations were available to me. They were. Someone had driven out before dawn. Someone from Pete's crew. Maybe Pete himself. Though Pete was not given to gestures and he was not given to getting up before dawn and driving 4 miles of gravel road to leave a sharpening stone on a toolbox without knocking. Or the stone had been there before I arrived and I'd simply not noticed it, which required me to believe I'd spread a tarp over a 9-inch stone for 5 days, without noticing the shape of it, which I could not make myself believe. Or I had placed it there myself in some half-awake state I had no memory of, which was not something I had ever done in 58 years of living. Each of those explanations had a specific failure. I named each failure to myself, the way a man checks a list. And when I'd gone through all 3, I was left with what I was left with. I took one of my chisels out of the toolbox. I held it over the smooth face of the stone at the proper angle, heel first, and I worked it slowly from heel to edge. The motion my hands remembered without being told. The stone had the right grit. It was a good stone. The chisel's edge came up bright and clean in 3 passes, and I wiped it on the flannel rag I kept for the purpose. And I felt Loretta's absence with a force and specificity that I had not felt since the week after she died, because that was the last morning I had done this the way it was supposed to be done, the whetstone on the lid where she had put it, my hands going through the motions she had made possible for me every day for 12 years. I did not cry. I want to be accurate about that. What I did was sit very still for a while with the chisel in my hand and the stone in my lap. And the feeling that moved through me was not grief the way I usually felt it, which was mostly a kind of hollowness and avoidance. This was grief the way grief feels when it is witnessed, when someone else has seen it and acknowledged it without words. I didn't know what to do with that. I went to work. I sharpened every blade I owned that morning, all of them, chisel by chisel and plane blade by plane blade. And the work I did that day was the best work I had done in 2 years. That evening, the 5th evening, the light was going the same way it had gone the night before, gold and thin and falling away fast, and Grip and I were on the porch again. I had the whetstone in my jacket pocket. I wasn't ready to put it in the toolbox yet. The hemlock stand went quiet. I noticed it because the hemlock stand hadn't been quiet before. There was always something moving in there at dusk, birds settling, branches giving and taking, the small adjustments of a stand of trees at the end of a day. That sound was just gone. Grip raised his head. He was on his feet in a moment, not in alarm, but in the particular readiness of an old dog who has caught something true. His tail moved once, very slowly. Something stepped out of the hemlock stand. I will try to be accurate. It was large, larger than anything I had a category for, and it moved through the last gap in the trees and stopped at the edge of the clearing with the stillness of something that did not need to hide, and knew it did not need to hide. Dark-furred, or dark in a way that resolved as fur in the failing light, and it stood upright. 8 feet, maybe more. At that distance and in that light, I could not be precise. Its width was wrong in the way that the scale of old-growth trees is wrong when you stand next to them, a dimension that your body recognizes before your mind does, as being outside the ordinary register of things. It was still, completely still. The way a man stands still when he is watching something he does not want to disturb. I did not move either. I want to be honest about this. I was not brave in that moment. I was simply unable to move. My body had made a decision that preempted whatever my mind would have decided if it had been consulted, and the decision was to hold very, very still. Grip sat back down against my boot. The slow wag of his tail continued, unhurried, certain. The creature's eyes were on me. I could not see the colour of them, and I could not see them clearly, but I knew they were on me the way you know when anyone is looking at you directly, through some mechanism the body has that doesn't require the eyes to verify. It looked at me for a long time, and I looked back at it, and there was something in the looking that I have thought about many times since, some quality to that moment that I did not fully understand while it was happening. It was not threatening, and it was not friendly. Not in any way I would apply either of those words to a human encounter. It was something more like recognition. The sense that something you did not know was watching you, has been watching for longer than you knew, and has decided to let you know it. Then it stepped back. Not fast, not startled, deliberately. One step, two, back into the hemlock shadow. And then the shadow took it, and it was gone. The trees made sound again, the small adjustments of settling wood and needles, as if the stand had simply resumed. I stood on that porch for a long time after. The stars came out while I stood there. They were very clear, the way stars are clear on cold nights in hill country, and I watched them come out one at a time over the ridge, and I did not go inside for a while. Grip went to sleep against my boot. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my sleeping bag in the main room with the wood stove going low, and the dog curled behind my knees, and I thought about Loretta's hands on that whetstone every morning. She had not been a person who made big declarations. 30 years of marriage, and I could count the speeches on one hand. She was a person who did things, who set the stone where I would find it, who got up before I did in the cold to do a thing I hadn't asked for and wouldn't have thought to ask for, because she knew what my mornings needed before I did. I thought about that, and I thought about the stone in my jacket pocket, and I lay there in the dark and let whatever was going to move through me, move through me. By the time the wood stove was fully cold, I had made a decision about one thing. I was going to call Cal. My son and I had not spoken in real words for the better part of a year. We'd exchanged messages around Loretta's death and the services, but those were messages with a practical content, logistics and times, and what to do with her things. After that, the distance between us had settled back into the shape it had been taking for a few years. The shape that happens when two people are very alike in the ways that make conversation difficult, and neither of them is willing to be the one to say the obvious thing first. I was 58 years old, and I had been the one not willing, and I knew it, and knowing it had not been enough to change it until now. I finished the Calder job in the allotted 4 weeks. I worked the last 10 days with sharp blades, and I put good work into that cabin. The best finish work I think I'd done in years. The whetstone I kept in my jacket pocket during the day and in the toolbox at night, wrapped in the flannel rag. I checked the hemlock stand every morning and every evening. There was nothing there that I could point to. Once, near the end of the second week, Grip raised his head toward the north end of the clearing at midday, held it for about 30 seconds, and then put it down again. I stopped what I was doing and watched for a few minutes. The trees were still. I went back to work. On the drive back to town on the last day of October, Grip had his head out the window for the first mile of gravel road and then pulled it in as the road smoothed and put it on my knee. The Whetstone was in the toolbox in the truck bed, wrapped in the flannel rag. I drove the 4 miles of gravel and then the paved road home, and it was a Tuesday afternoon, and the sky was the particular pale blue you get in late October, when all the colour is in the trees instead of the air. I called Cal that night. He answered on the third ring, the way he always had, and he said my name in the careful way he'd taken to saying it, the way you say a name when you're not sure what's coming. I told him I was coming out to see him. I said I should have come out a long time ago. Those were not the exact words, but that was the shape of it. There was quiet on his end, and then he said, "Okay, yeah," and I could hear in those 2 words the same 2 years I'd been carrying, the same flat weight of time having passed without the things being said that needed saying. He asked me when, and I said whenever worked for him, and he said next month would work. I said all right. We talked for maybe 4 more minutes, most of it practical, about what highway I'd take and whether I should bring Grip, and he said yes, bring Grip, which told me something. We didn't say anything important after that. We didn't need to yet. Cal lived 3 states away, outside a small city where he'd taken work after his mother died and not come back. I understood why, now, more than I had then. I drove out to see him in November, the 2nd week. Grip rode in the back seat and slept most of the way, and when we got there, Cal came out to the driveway and crouched down in the gravel and let Grip put both paws on his shoulders, and for a moment my son just had his face in that dog's neck, the way you do when you need a moment before a conversation starts. I stood by the truck and looked at the yard, which was small and kept up, more kept up than I'd expected, and I thought that Loretta would have been glad of that. We talked for 2 days. Not constantly, not confrontationally, mostly just in the way that 2 people who have been alone separately begin to be somewhere together again. He cooked. He was a better cook than his mother, which I told him, and he laughed for the first time I'd heard in a while. I didn't tell him about the cabin or the Whetstone or the hemlock stand. I wasn't ready, and it wasn't the point. The point was that I was there and that I stayed 2 days, and that when I left he walked out to the truck with me and stood at the door while I got in and said, "Come back before Christmas." I said I would. I meant it. 3 months after I drove back down that gravel road away from the Calder cabin, I was on a new job, a smaller job, a single-room addition on a house outside a town I won't name. A straightforward month's work for a retired teacher who wanted a room with good light and solid trim. Grip was at my feet while I worked, his grey muzzle resting on my boot the way he'd been resting it on my boot for 12 years. And he was getting slow now, slower than he'd been in October, with the particular careful quality of a dog who has decided that moving quickly is not worth the investment. I watched him sometimes when he didn't know I was watching, the way his breathing had deepened and slowed, and I thought about what it means to know something without being able to hold on to it. My blades were sharp. They had been sharp every morning for 3 months. I sharpened them each morning at the tailgate, with the Whetstone set on the toolbox lid, the way it had been set that 5th morning in October, and I went through the motion my hands knew, heel to edge, and I wiped each blade on the flannel rag when I was done. It took about 20 minutes each morning, those 20 minutes after the coffee was made and before the first cut of the day. I had not missed one. I don't think often now about what the thing in the hemlock stand was. I thought about it a great deal in the weeks just after, running through what I'd seen, checking the description against things I knew, coming up empty each time in the way you come up empty when you are using a category that doesn't contain what you're looking at. After a while, the trying got quieter, and then it mostly stopped. What I have now is not an explanation. What I have is the memory of standing at the edge of that porch with Grip at my boot, and the last light gone and something at the tree line that looked at me and let me look back, and the sense that I had been seen by something that had been paying a kind of attention I couldn't account for and couldn't dismiss. I have two things to say about what I carry from that month, and then I'll let it be. The first is that the Whetstone is in my toolbox bag right now, in the truck bed outside, wrapped in the same flannel rag. I have sharpened every blade I own with it, and it has not worn the way a stone that size should wear after 3 months of daily use. A whetstone of that size and grit, used daily, should show the dish in the centre by now, the concave wear of repeated use along the same path. This one is flat. I check it with a straight edge sometimes, the way I'd check any reference surface, and it is flat. I don't have an explanation for that, and I've stopped looking for one. The second is smaller. On a morning in early January, Grip stopped at the tailgate while I was getting my tools out, and he lifted his head toward the tree line at the south end of this new property, and his tail made one slow pass, the same motion it had made on the porch in October. I watched the trees for a minute. I didn't see anything. There was nothing there that I could point to, no shape in the shadows, no absence of sound, nothing I could put a measurement to. But I kept my hand on the toolbox lid for a moment before I opened it. Just a moment. Then I went to work, and Grip lowered his nose back to my boot and closed his eyes and stayed.